In the first session of statistics, we took a look at the big picture. And the first part of the big picture talked about how we gather a sample from our population. That was called producing data. And then, once we got the data, we did exploratory data analysis, which summarized the data. And then probability helped us to get inference about the entire population based on the sample. In session 2, we're going to talk about how we organize the data. So, what we mean by data is we mean that data are pieces of information about individuals organized into variables. And individuals are a particular person or object. And a variable is a characteristic about that individual. And how we organize that data is with a data set. And data sets are typically displayed in tables, which rows represent the individuals and columns represent the variables. Let's take a look at an example. So in this example, we have a data set. That's this entire table-looking thing. Sometimes we organize it with Microsoft Excel, or in this class we'll be doing a lot of data set organization with StatCrunch. There's lots of different ways, lots of different programs to help us organize data sets, but the general structure of a data set, we have the variables on the columns. So in this case, how many variables we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 variables. And we have 75 individuals. Individuals are organized on the rows. Variables on the columns, individuals on the rows. But when we talk about variables, remember variables, that's these 5 characteristics about the individuals. The variables can be organized into 2 different classifications, categorical or quantitative. Categorical variables take category or label values and place them on an individual. Each observation can only have one category, and categories are mutually exclusive. That means that an individual can't be in 2 categories at the same time. So, in this case, our first categorical variable would be gender, because we could place an individual on one of 2 categories, male or female. So in this case, individual 1 is placed into the category male, individual 2, female, individual 3, female, so on and so forth. Our other variable is called quantitative. Quantitative variables take on numerical values and represent some kind of measurement. So let's see. Age takes on some numerical value and some measurement. It measures how old somebody is. Weight is quantitative as well. It measures how much somebody weighs in pounds. Height measures how tall someone is in inches. Let's talk about this variable here, smoking. Would this be categorical or quantitative? Well, in this case, it really doesn't measure anything. It just says if someone smokes or not. If they don't smoke, they label that as a 1. If they do smoke, that's a 2. Just because you see a number there doesn't make it quantitative. Well, what makes it quantitative if it is numerical and it measures something? In this case, it's categorical. It puts someone into a category, smoker or non-smoker. So in this case, smoking is a categorical variable. Race, categorical variable as well. So let's see, how many categorical variables do we have? 1, 2, 3 categorical variables, and then the 3 variables in the middle are numerical, sometimes called quantitative. I think it should be noted that sometimes categorical variables are sometimes referred to as, we got quantitative, qualitative variables, or what categorical variables are sometimes referred to. But in this class, we'll refer to them as categorical variables. So 2 types of variables, categorical and quantitative. So in session 2, we need to know about how we organize the variables into data sets, the different types of variables, quantitative and categorical. What's the difference between an individual and a variable? But we also, the second part of this session, we need to talk about examining distribution. So what is a distribution? Distribution is what values the variable takes, and how often does the variable take those values. So, a lot of times how we summarize that is with something called a frequency distribution. And a frequency distribution talks about, in this case, a categorical variable and the values that it takes. In this case, what we have is we have a categorical variable that asks the question about what someone thinks about their body image. And it looks like that some of the values that could be taken by the categorical variable would be about right, overweight, or underweight. And a frequency distribution says how many individuals thought their body image was about right, how many individuals thought that their body was overweight, and how many individuals thought their body was underweight. So it gives us a count. And then the next column we have the percent. So 71.3% of the individuals took the value about right when asked about their body image. Almost 20%, 19.6%, considered their body to be overweight, and 9.2% considered their body to be underweight. So what we're looking at here is called a frequency distribution. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how we further describe the distribution of a single categorical variable. So we saw categorical variables can be described with a frequency distribution. But then how can we do graphical displays of categorical variables is really one of two ways: the pie chart and the bar graph. The pie chart gives us a visual representation of the percent of values that a variable might take, and as does the bar chart. A lot of times I think that you'll see the bar chart as opposed to the pie chart, but I think that we need to be aware that both are used with categorical variables. Then even sometimes we see pictographs, but we got to be careful because sometimes pictographs can be misleading. In this case, we see an example of how a pictograph represents Time having much more money for advertisements than the U.S. News. Well, that's because the area of this pen is quite a bit larger than the area of this pen. Well, with pictographs, it's easy a lot of times to deal with area. Now remember, with pictographs, we don't want to see area, but we want to see the height of these. So they should have all had the same width, and they obviously don't, so that's what makes this pictograph misleading. Okay, so what did we learn in lesson 2? I think what we learned was, we learned data are pieces of information about individuals, and by individuals we mean particular people or objects. A variable is a characteristic about an individual. A data set is how we organize individuals with their variable characteristics. There's two different types of variables. There's categorical and there's quantitative. What do we mean by a distribution? A distribution is what values the variable takes and how often do they take those values. How do we measure a distribution, or how do we summarize a distribution? Is with a frequency distribution. And frequency distribution talks about the value of the variables, and then how often does an individual take the value of that variable? That's the count. And then what percent of the time does that variable take that value? And then we talked about the two different ways that we can graphically describe a single categorical variable is with a pie chart and a bar graph. And we know to sometimes be aware of pictographs. Alright, now be careful because sometimes we're going to be using StatCrunch to get these graphs and these frequency distributions. StatCrunch should be in your Blackboard course shell under MyLabs Plus. So I'm going to Blackboard now. Now into the statistics. Remember in MyLabs Plus, that's where we find our homework, but it's also where we find StatCrunch. So in StatCrunch is also a good place where we can find data sets. So I'm going to get a data set from the StatCrunch website. And let's see, from up here in Explore, we can get some data. And let's explore the weight perception data set. From the weight perception, we have what? A categorical variable, numerical variable, numerical variable, numerical variable, categorical variable. So with the categorical variable, our first variable here, gender, let's do a frequency distribution. That's going to be under stat, tables, frequency. And we want the first variable there, gender. That's going to give us our frequency distribution. And then we can also give the two types of graphs. Graph, pie chart. We have the data here. Our first categorical variable, gender. Now it gives us our pie chart. And our bar graph. That's from graph, bar plot. We have the data, gender again. And then we'll compute that. Okay, so what can we see from the frequency distribution is we have very similar frequencies with male and female. A few more males were surveyed than females, were sampled rather, and the bar graph and the pie chart shows that as well. Let's see if we can get a quick summary of our second categorical variable. If we go to bar graph with data, how would you describe your weight and compute that? So from here we can see that the most frequent response to our categorical variable would be that most people think that their weight is about right. And then with the least frequency going to very underweight. Let's see if we can do a relative frequency. So we can edit, and then from edit we can change the type to relative frequency or percent. Either one's fine. Then we can see well over 50% of the time. What's that? 56% of the time. The individuals in the sample said that their weight was about right. And then also gives descriptions about the other responses as well. Okay, this concludes statistics session 2.